Hello and welcome to the Cook Memorial Public Library Podcast. I'm your host, Nate Goss. As the year 2021 wraps up, it is time once again for our annual Favorite Books podcast episode. For these episodes, we have Popular Services staff member Joe Hansen onto the podcast to talk about the staff favorites fiction and nonfiction booklets that she edits every single year and are a huge hit at the library. For these booklets, Joe meticulously collects lists of every Cook Memorial Public Library staff member's favorite books of the year, and then works to edit and compile booklets of hundreds of book titles worth reading that came out this year. Every year, I look through these booklets and find so many titles that I missed and now want to read. And this year was no exception. I always look forward to this podcast episode and having Joe highlight just a little sampling of the books that are featured in these favorite booklets. So let's jump right in, and here is my conversation with Joe about our favorite books of 2021 as selected by Cook Memorial Public Library District staff. All right, Joe Hansen, welcome back to the Cook Memorial Public Library Podcast. Always great to have you on for this sort of last episode of the year.
Good to be here, Nate.
So 2021, last year, it was a kind of an odd year, of course, because of the pandemic, and I feel like a little bit of that has continued to seep through into this year as well. But just like last year, there was no shortage of great books to read. So before we jump right into the titles, let's talk a little bit about these great booklets that you put together every single year. We've got two booklets, one for fiction, one for nonfiction. And you've been putting these together for 11 years now, which is just an incredible feat. So do you want to just tell us a little bit more about how the books turned out this time around?
Yes, it's hard to believe we've been doing this for 11 years. And for patrons who want to go down memory lane and see the previous 10 years, they are all on our website. If you go to the Books, Movies, and Music page, and scroll down to the annual staff favorites, you can click on there and see all the different years. And for people who can't get into the library to pick up the booklets, the 2021 virtual ones will be on our website.
Yeah, and actually what we'll do is we'll link to those in our show notes as well. So if you're listening to this podcast episode, go ahead and check those show notes out. But yes, if you are on the website, it'll be on the Books, Movies, and Music page. So compared to the other years, do we have about the same number of titles? Do we have even more titles? Or, how many books are we actually talking about here?
Sure. For the fiction book, it is the same because I could have made it even bigger because we read so much this year, but our copy machine just can't handle it any bigger. It's at its max for size. It would be hard to fold and staple the booklet. But we have 164 titles in the fiction booklet. We have something for everybody. All different genres are covered. I surveyed the entire library staff because we're a great group of readers and very diverse titles this year. Our staff has been involved in a Read Bigger initiative again, where we're trying to diversify our reading, and that is reflected in this booklet. So we have many authors of different races, ethnicities, religions, sexual orientation. So that's really good to see. But the most popular title, there's always one big title of the year that staffers really liked. And this year is no different. The most popular title, which was recommended by 6 staffers, is one that's kind of under the radar. You won't see it on a lot of best lists, which is why I love these booklets, because we do have all the big hitters, the big authors in there, but we also have a lot of authors who you might not have heard of.
I love that it's a booklet that really is unique to our community.
Right. And you might not have heard of this book. It's called The Guncle by Steve Rowley. Matter of fact, it was featured just the other day on NPR, and I thought that was interesting.
We were ahead of the game, huh?
Yeah.
We got to it before NPR.
Some love. That's exactly. And this is a word of mouth book. I think Andrea Larson read it first and wrote a blog post about it. And by the way, a plug for our blog called Shelf Life. We feature a book every week where that we recommend, and she recommended The Guncle. And it's just a great book. It's about an Uncle Patrick, that he's gay, and so they call him Guncle for gay uncle. And there's a tragedy that hits his family when his very best friend, she dies from cancer, and she has 2 little kids, and her husband is having a hard time. So Patrick Gunkel steps in to help with the two kids. And he decides he's going to take care of them for a while. And he has no experience at raising kids. Plus, he lives in Palm Beach. But it's just so funny because they teach him a lot and he teaches them his Gunkel rules. And it's just hilarious. And if you want a feel-good book, this is the one to read.
Yeah, and I was listening back to our episode from last year, and it was filled with a lot of heavy books, a lot of books dealing with heavy, heavy topics. So it's nice to kind of right off the bat, let's start with something just a little bit lighter, a little breezier, a little funny,
Exactly. Yeah, and there's still a lot of heavy books this year for people like me
who
sure. like the heavy.
I like it too,
the heavy
yeah.
books. Yeah, and then the next book is a heavy book that Five Staffers recommended, and it's also getting some love on the best books of the year, and it's called Razorblade Tears by S.A. Cosby. Now, S.A. Cosby, this is his second book. He is an up-and-coming African-American author, and I heard an interview with him at a mystery convention, and he was talking about growing up in a house that had no running water. They were dirt poor, and somehow, despite his upbringing, he has become this wonderful author. I mean, his books are pretty heavy. This newest one is called Razorblade Tears. This is about a gay couple. One was Black, one was white, and they are murdered. And their two fathers decide to try to figure out what happened and solve this crime. And one of the fathers is an ex-con, really tough and ultra-conservative, and it wasn't really happy his son was gay. And the other father is Black, and they have very different political views, but yet they come together, overcoming their prejudices about each other, and actually become kind of bros and try to figure out what happened to their sons and who killed them. And then many of the titles in our favorites this year are some of the top fiction of the year. And I just want to give also a little shout out to, I had a blog post yesterday and today that I do every year of the top fiction and nonfiction of the year. And we pretty much have all those titles at the top represented.
Yeah. And we will link to that in our show notes as well, so people can definitely take a look and read that, because I think you do a really good job of sort of giving a nice cliff notes of all the different national lists that are put out every year. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about what were some of the big books of the year, nationally speaking.
Yeah,
fiction. We're still talking fiction, by the way.
Yeah, we're still doing fiction. We'll do nonfiction in a few minutes. Well, and one reason I do these lists is I just love the best lists of the year personally. So I just always compile them for my own benefit. And the very, very top favorite, and it's one of my favorites of the year of all the fiction, is The Harlem Shuffle by Colson Whitehead. I love Colson Whitehead. He's just one of my favorites. And his previous book was really heavy, The Underground Railroad. But Harlem Shuffle, he decided he was going to try to write something a little lighter. And so he came up with this wonderful storyline about 1960s Harlem. And his main character is Ray Carney, who has a furniture store in Harlem in 1960s. And, he tries to be straight and narrow as much as he can, but he's got a cousin who's kind of a crook, low time crook. And Ray kind of brings in, he'll fence like stolen jewelry for the cousin and, just a little bit, just to make a little extra money. Because, furniture sales isn't that lucrative and it's kind of a tough time.
Sure.
But his cousin kind of gets him more and more involved. And he suddenly becomes involved in like shady cops, local gangsters, and low life pornographers all of a sudden. And so he's involved in this heist, and that's starting to go wrong. So it's a crime caper. It's funny. It's historical fiction. It's got all these wonderful things mixed up together.
Yeah.
And it really, truly is a wonderful book. And this is the year 2021. A lot of the big books came out this year, because I think with the pandemic, a lot of the publishers thought, well, we don't want to put out books during the pandemic. We want to wait until it's over. And of course, it's still not over.
But yeah, so you're saying all these big books came out this year, huh?
Oh, it's the big heavy hitters. Well, Colson Whitehead, of course. Anthony Doerr is another one. He wrote All the Light You Cannot See a few years ago, and he won the Pulitzer Prize for it. He has a mega book out now called Cloud Cuckoo Land, which also is highly reviewed. I love this book, and I reviewed it on our blog. It follows the story of 4 young dreamers and outcasts through time and space. from 1453 Constantinople to the future. And they all have a common thread. They all love this old ancient Greek story called Cloud Cuckoo Land, which Anthony Doerr made up, which is brilliant, but it reads like an old great ancient Greek story.
Wow.
But so you got the siege of Constantinople in the 1400s. You have present day, and you also have a teenager who becomes an eco-terrorist involved too. So you got the whole climate change and environmental issues. And then you've got a girl in the future who is on a spaceship with her parents because the planet has been destroyed. So you've got all these factors, but yet they're all tied together by this Cloud Cuckoo Land story. It's just great. And how he ties it together at the end is amazing. And it's a big book. It's like, over 500 pages, I think. But if you're up for a big book challenge, I would recommend that a lot. So another book that's out this year, the big authors, you got Jonathan Franzen, who just started he has a trilogy about a dysfunctional family. And plus we have Kazuo Ishiguro, who is most famous probably for Remains of the Day. He has a new one out called Clara and the Sun, which is just a lovely book about, an artificial intelligence robot. And it's, again, in the future. You can tell there's climate change in the background. Bad things have gone on, and this teenager gets this female robot to be a companion for her, and it's all pretty much told from the robot's point of view, and she has some emotions, so they've given her emotions, and it's just lovely, and you think about it for a long time. Great book. And another big hitter is Amor Towles, who wrote Gentleman in Moscow. He has a new book out called The Lincoln Highway. And it's just kind of a road trip, 1950s, these orphans and lost boys, and they end up taking the Lincoln Highway, which is a real thing that connects New York City to California. And they have all these misadventures. There's a lot of Odyssey themes in it. It's so historical fiction. If you like that, that's an awesome book. And another big author who just came out, and I just finished her book, is Louise Erdrich. She is one of our greatest Native American authors. She has a new book out called The Sentence. And the backdrop of that is a bookstore in Minneapolis, and it's haunted by their most annoying deceased patron. But it turns out Louise Erdrich has a bookstore in Minneapolis, and the bookstore owner in this book is named Louise. But it takes place during the pandemic. So you get the feel of the pandemic and trying to run a bookstore during the pandemic. And then, of course, Minneapolis, you got the George Floyd killing. So you deal with that too. And so you're dealing with all these crises and trying to keep the bookstore alive. And she dropped so many titles of books, which are all listed at the end too, the book list. And it's just a great book for readers. But you also get a new perspective on Native Americans. They talk about, they go out to the protests because they themselves had been brutalized by police for many, many years. And people aren't aware of that it was a common problem in the Native community. So I really love that book too.
Yeah.
So it's a big, big year for the main mega authors, but also a big year for the smaller authors.
So you just threw out some titles that were big books. If someone's just looking for like a really good short read, do you have something in your booklet that would fit that bill?
Well, I just finished a short story collection and I don't read short stories generally, but I felt compelled to, and it's called My Monticello, and the author is Jocelyn Nicole Johnson. I listened to this book and it was amazing. They had different voices for the different short stories, and they're almost like performance pieces. But there's also a novella at the end called My Monticello, and it's a book about the future. It takes place in Virginia, and the white supremacists have taken over, and they're killing Black people. And the main characters, they go flee to Monticello to hide to Jefferson's home, And it turns out that the main character, she is a descendant of Thomas Jefferson. She's like one of his granddaughters, because with Sally Hemings.
Yeah.
But it's a short book. It's under, maybe like 200 pages. And if you want to try short stories, that's a really good one to try.
For that one, if you go back a couple episodes of our podcast, we had the Bookies Live about family themes, and Andrea talks in more detail about that collection. All right, well, you just threw out so many great fiction titles. We don't want to leave out nonfiction, so let's pivot a little bit to the nonfiction because you've got, probably is it about the same amount of nonfiction to fiction that you've recommended in these booklets?
Well, it's always more fiction than nonfiction, but this year I got so much nonfiction from the staff that I was able to increase the booklet by 16. So this year we have 124 nonfiction books, and they all cover the Dewey Decimal System from the zeros all the way up to the 900s and the biographies. Our most popular category this year was history in the 900s. We have 18 titles that are about history, followed by, and this is always a trend with us, 300s of social sciences. We have a lot of books about that. The most popular book this year read by staffers is one that's under the radar again. It's called "You'll Never Believe What Happened to Lacey: Crazy Stories About Racism" by Amber Ruffin and Lacey Lamar. And this is written by a writer and performer on Late Night with Seth Meyers and her sister. And it's just funny and I guess full of heart, talking about some of the absurd anecdotes they have as young African-American women. And like I said, 5 staffers read this and they said it was just great. Eye-opening, but also funny. And another book that is short kind of essays is written by a popular young adult author. So John Green is usually in our fiction booklets, but he has an essays. It's called I'm going to say this wrong, I think. Anthropocene Reviewed.
Anthropocene Reviewed, yes.
Essays on a Human-Centered Planet. And so he just reviews different things like from the Taco Bell breakfast menu and the QWERTY on the keyboard. That one got a lot of love. Like I said, I know him from his young adult fiction. And so I'm going to have to read this just to enjoy his nonfiction.
Yeah.
And a book that is one of the top reviewed nonfiction books of the year by critics was recommended by 4 of our staffers, and it's called Crying in H Mart. It's a memoir by Michelle Zauner, and she's the Japanese breakfast indie pop star, and she gives a full-length account of her reflections and experiences of growing up Korean American and becoming a professional musician and caring for her terminally ill mother. That one is, if you like memoirs, that should be a really good one. And the top nonfiction book of the year that was reviewed was recommended by 3 of our staffers, and it's called Empire of Pain: The Secret History of the Sackler Dynasty by Patrick Radden Keith. He's the award-winning author of the book Say Nothing. And this is supposed to be a tremendous nonfiction book if you want to learn more about the opioid crisis and how this family made gobs of money on it. One trend I noticed in our nonfiction this year, and it's curious, our graphic novels were more like nonfiction books.
Interesting.
And Nate, Nate, you read several of them. One of the ones, like The Hidden History of the Women's Led Slave Revolts by Rebecca Hall.
Yes, yeah, called Wake, yeah. Yes,
Wake, that's in there. And it's something about a little known part of American history that I didn't know about. So I want to read that. And, up at the top of the nonfiction this year is another graphic novel that you read called Seek You: A Journey Through American Loneliness by Kristen Radke. So tell me about that one.
She just does a really good overview of the history of loneliness and depression, even just getting into like the medical community and different ways that it's been viewed over the years. And then she also brings her own life into it, kind of talks about her own perspective and struggling with loneliness and living in urban settings where you can feel a little isolated. And I think it just also came out at a really good time, because we are still living through this pandemic and people are, dealing with maybe extra bouts of depression and loneliness. And so it can be really helpful to read something like this, maybe even in a comic form, where you kind of realize, A, you're not alone, and B, this is something that, is a condition. And that you can learn more about it. It was just a really insightful read for me, at least, and it sounds like it was for other staff members as well.
Yeah.
One aspect of nonfiction that I know there are people who really enjoy these kind of books are, of course, the cookbooks. Do we have
Yes.
any? Do we have any cookbooks in our staff favorites list this year?
We have several cookbooks that we highlight, including some familiar faces like Emma Garten and the Pioneer Woman. But there's also one here that Jean recommends called the Korean Vegan Cookbook, Reflections and Recipes from Oma's Kitchen. So it's not just recipes, but it's storytelling. And she was on TikTok with the Korean Vegan. And so she shares snapshots of food that shaped her family history. And her name is Joanne Lee Molinaro. Well, if you're looking for a little fun, different cookbook that kind of gives some stories behind the food, that would be good.
Yeah, I love those. Yeah.
And my favorite nonfiction book of the year that I read is actually, you go back to England, and it's called Pastoral Song, A Farmer's Journey by James Rebanks. He chronicles the family farm's evolution in the England's Lake District across 3 generations, and how he has tried to transform his farm from being, the pesticide-ridden, not good for the environment farm to a very eco-friendly farm. And I love this book. I grew up with farmers in Wisconsin, and they worked so hard. And you got a real sense of what it's like to be a farmer and how they struggle. And it's just so evocative, and he's a brilliant writer.
So you just said what your favorite nonfiction book was of the year. I always like to ask what was your favorite fiction book of the year before we kind of wrap things up here. And it's always so I feel like it's always your hardest question every year when I ask
it
this.
It is so hard. Because I have several, and I've mentioned a lot of them already, but I think I have to give it to Cloud Cuckoo Land because for its originality, it's so different. Because I read a lot, and something that's a little different. And I think the spin he did, that's what drew me in. So I have to give it to Cloud Cuckoo Land.
Awesome. Well, Joe, thank you so much for throwing out so many titles here. And this is just a little sneak preview of what's in these booklets. So before we go, do you want to just talk a little bit about how our patrons can get their hands on these things?
Absolutely. You just come to the reference desk at Cook or Aspen Drive Libraries. We have them on display. And as Nate said before, we will be having them on our website too soon, on the Books, Movies, and Music page. So you can look at them scrolling on your computer. We look forward to seeing you come in. And remember last year when you picked up holds and to pick up our booklets, you had to come into our little lobby or you couldn't come into the building. So it's so nice to see people in the building again.
Yes. Yeah.
A year ago, we didn't have that.
Yes. All right. Well, yes, I love looking through these booklets every single year. I just want to thank you once again, Joe, for putting all the hard work into creating these and compiling all the titles and everything. I think our patrons really appreciate it as well. And I want to thank you for coming back once again onto the podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
All right, so that just about wraps up another year of great conversations about excellent books. Joe already talked about where you can get your hands on these staff favorite booklets. Stop by the reference desk at either of our locations or visit our website. That website is cooklib.org. And as was mentioned a couple times in the episode, make sure that you also stop by the library's blog, Shelf Life, where you can read a lot of those reviews that Joe talked about, along with some local history stories, genealogy tips, and so much more. That blog can be found at shelflife.cooklib.org. I also wanted to mention that Joe also maintains our library's Goodreads account. So if you are on Goodreads, you can actually follow the library there and throughout the year see what books our staff are reading. And before we wrap up the podcast for the year, I just want to remind you can always reach out to us anytime with your comments or questions about the podcast. You can email us at webmaster@cooklib.org or talk to us on Twitter @CookLibrary is how you can find us there. If you liked this episode, please share it with your friends and family. Let them know that they can get this episode along with any past episodes of the Cook Memorial Public Library podcasts in Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, or really wherever they like to get their podcasts. We will be back soon, but until then, have a happy holidays, have a happy new year, and keep reading, keep watching, and keep listening.